I feel like wanting to improve and change who you are is something that a lot of people can do. They can agree to it, they can feel like it's something that matters, and I feel like it just never lasts for a long enough time to actually make a change. And I think a lot of times people kind of get clouded in your head, or a minor setback happens and it kind of pushes you back to what you once thought. And a lot of times improving feels worthless. It can kind of feel pointless. It's like, well, this is all going to end. Why even try to change things? And I feel like a lot of times, that might feel true, but I feel like there's a bigger message there. There's a bigger, part of it that definitely makes a lot more sense when you are trying to accept these things that have happened to you. Acceptance is really all of it. That's really what you have to focus on when you are trying to improve as a person and improve, moving on and healing from everything that's happened. Acceptance is really the only thing you need. When you're trying to love other people and accepting their flaws or get over the things that have happened to your past, you have to accept it. You have to be able to not just use time to distract yourself or to forget what has happened to you, but to actually accept that it has happened and that it is part of you. And now you're able to heal with it. A lot of times moving on isn't necessarily the fact that saying it doesn't hurt anymore, but it's saying that you're capable of accepting that it's happened and it doesn't have to hold you back now. You can now have your own future, your own, purpose in the end of the day without having, this thing holding back to you or feeling like a weight. And I think as soon as you kind of unclip that weight from your life, it gets a lot easier to love. And that's loving yourself and loving other people. That part of acceptance is the most important to experience because you become a new person out of it. You become a new image of yourself. You are reborn when you are able to kind of accept these things that have happened and still become a new person at the end of the day. That is the whole point in feeling better about that situation and being able to move on from it. And I think a lot of people haven't moved on from things, and some people have, but how they move now is where there's a disconnect. And I think building, life outside of the sadness, and I talked about it in my last video, and I feel like a few videos, honestly, of this experiencing of sadness and saying that, well, I've been in this sad pit, or falling back in that sad pit is hurting you, and it is. I feel like we just can't build a home out of that, and that home is definitely something that a lot of people do. And the worst part is about that home is that we keep it. Even when we aren't sad, we still keep that home because it's so easy to return to that feeling of being miserable after, like I said earlier, a minor setback, or really the smallest thing that happens. We have to just feel more confident to know that we can change from those things. We are capable of making that difference. And a lot of times, in videos or even messages, or I'll get DMs or people commenting, and I say, you have to love yourself. And a lot of people get confused what that means. And it's more than just some solo dates, it's more than, affirmations to yourself, but it's acceptance of yourself. It's not something that you should ever feel pity or feel negative about. It's you. There's never going to be another you in history. And I think that in itself shows you how significant of a change it is. That change is the most important thing. And I think when you want to experience a big change, what it truly means to change, it starts with acceptance. The same way, moving on, it starts with denial. I think when you're growing and you're trying to become a new person, you have to accept those things that have happened. You have to realize that you can be a new person whenever you want. And I kind of talked on having this endless reset button in life. And life is really just a bunch of good choices in a row that get you to where you want to be. And those choices are definitely going to have setbacks. Those choices are definitely going to involve consequences or things you don't want or people you shouldn't have met or whatever that thing may be, and that's life. That's going to happen. That's not something you'll ever be able to hide or reject or act like, it doesn't affect you. But I feel like you have to experience those moments in order to grow, in order to have more for yourself. You kind of have to have these very low points. And those low points are teaching moments. Those are where you can actually grow the most for yourself in the end. And I think when you do want to feel better about these situations and kind of realize that you are capable, or whatever it may seem you're not, accepting that it's happened and that you can change is the biggest part of that. And I think the reason why acceptance is the hardest is because of that feeling that it's pointless. And I think when you fall into this paradox of wanting to prove yourself. You know, you get that random motivation late at night, or you get a random hit or surge or an idea that you are worth, that you are capable. And then something bad happens and you fall back into it and you feel like, wow, like I'm not doing anything with my life. You know, all these things, all these goals I have are so unachievable and I'm not obligated to do this. And this person doesn't actually like me. And why did this person treat me like this? And you kind of crowd yourself in so much negativity that it's hard to see that light at the end of the tunnel. And I feel like feeling like it's pointless, feeling like it's over is something that we can see from two different sides. You know, it's kind of like a glass half full or half empty type of thing. When you realize that, you know, that life ends, and that's what gives it value. I don't think a lot of people are realizing that that's kind of the whole point. That is why it is so important to experience these things, you know, when you're trying to do better for yourself, you know. Trying to improve can feel pointless because it ends, but you have to realize that's why it's important. You know, the fact that life ends is what gives it value, and you're able to do anything in this life. And I feel like once you realize that that pessimism isn't going to get you anywhere, you can realize that now you are capable of making whatever change. You know, it is your life. There's nothing truly limiting you to do whatever it is you want. You know, you are capable of going out of your way and helping people or moving on or dealing with whatever happened in your past and becoming a new person out of it. You know, those flaws and negative things that have happened aren't meant to define you, but it's who you are out of those things that add to your definition, you know, that add to your character. And I think a lot of times when you get stuck in this paradox of feeling like, well, there's no point of improving because all this is going to end, that's the whole goal. You are here living, and that is the purpose. It's to live, you know, to experience your own life. And that life is something that you are given and no one else gets to have. You know, it is your own life. You are your own person. And I think you have to take more pride and more significance in that. And that is what helps you, you know, do whatever it is that you want. And I think a lot of people get stuck on that feeling of, you know, well, I still feel sad about this, or, you know, I can't move on from how this person treated me, you know, and that negativity, those low moments are important to have because they can help you, you know, remind you of the good things that you're yet to experience and the good things that you already have had. You know, when you realize that you can't have that light without darkness, you know, it gets a lot easier to realize that you are capable of so much. And I think so many people put so much value in relationships or having connections or romance that they don't actually get to experience anything for themselves anymore. You know, they always feel like they have to have someone else or get this person's love or this person's approval in order to feel better about something, when that's not the case. You know, it's not exactly love that you're looking for. And I think a lot of times you're not looking for love, you're not looking for a relationship. You know, you don't realize that. And I think that relationship that you're hoping will come save you, that person that you're looking for, has to be you. You know, you are capable, you are that person. You are that very thing needed to save you. And I think when you have this idea that it's all pointless and well, you know, I'm not going to be able to change anything that's happened in the past. Yeah, that's the whole point. You get to live past it. It's not something that gets to control your future. You know, and I think when you let your past become your present, it ultimately will become your future. It's going to be a lot easier to experience negative things and ruminate in those negative things when you are so much more focused on it. And when I was talking about relationships, I feel like people have put so much value into that they feel like that is what's going to give them a sense of purpose, you know, a sense of self. That sense of self isn't going to come from another person. That comes from you. You know, that's the whole point of loving yourself. You know, you're not looking for a relationship. You just want proof that you're lovable, proof that people are able to come into your life and not leave, you know. And I think that is the biggest part of all of it, is that people have this feeling that how people treat them now determines their said value. You know, that's not the case at all. That's not something that you can actually have. That's not something that's, you know, even realistic to believe, because how are they actually going to know who you are? How are they going to value you when they have, you know, these mere interpretations? You know, you're not even yourself around some of these people, and they leave. You have this idea that it is every fiber of your, you know, being is wrong, isn't worth it. And when you think like this and you realize that it really is all perception at the end of the day, and I've said this in a lot of videos, that your perception shapes your reality. Even the language you use shapes your reality. That is why it is so important on how you treat and think about yourself. And I think a lot of times when you realize, if you had a friend that talked about you the way you talk about yourself, would you keep them around? And that is one of the biggest things you have to ask yourself. It's not that, oh, everything feels pointless. It's just that you put so much pressure on yourself to feel like you can't do it, so you make up an excuse. Oh, well, in 50, 60 years from now, I'll be gone, so it doesn't matter what I do in this present moment. And that's not going to change anything. You have that choice of feeling miserable. And you get to choose that every single day. Or you can wake up and you can appreciate what is around you. And I think when you get to value what's around you and to put so much less time into the negatives or things that you don't have or things that you haven't been able to do, and just focus on what you can do, what you still can go get, what you still can dream of, what you still can achieve, you'll realize that none of it's ever going to be pointless. You get to have that memory, you get to have that moment, and you get to grow. Each opportunity is a lane of growth. And it comes down to not even, feeding yourself delusion or being super optimistic. It comes to living and being present in those moments. And I've said a lot of times that life isn't about money. It's not about a certain job or career. It is those moments stacked together that give you, a life. It's like a physical film roll. And all these moments make up your movie. And I think it's very important that people have those moments and make them to feel something in their life. And that includes the hardships. That includes struggling. That includes rejection. But it also includes all the benefits, all the happy moments, all the moments that give you a reminder that you are alive, that you are capable, and ultimately you are loved. Those are the things we have to focus on. Those things are what's going to make you feel like there is a point to all this. I am capable. I am worth so much more than what that person or those people said. You have your own idea. And the more you start to listen to that idea of yourself, the more you get to find yourself, you get to create yourself, you get to add on, and you become who you are supposed to be. That's the whole point.